Mr. Anil Razdan, Sanjay Joshi, Mr. Dhar, Mr. Mauskar, Mr. Turvedi, other eminences in the audience, ladies and gentlemen. I'm extremely honored to join this annual Petro India conference, and especially because the theme of the conference is the future of mobility in India, outlook and challenges. And it was good. I hadn't expected it, but Mr. Dhar's presentation was erudite and so full of facts and forward-looking that it's been a real bonus to sit through that presentation and learn all that he has told us about the future of mobility in India. Ladies and gentlemen, we in Niti Aayog have been in the midst, in the very center of trying to develop a sort of framework for electric mobility in the country. But I mean, there have been, as he said in his presentations, and I heard outside, we need a fair bit of clarity going forward as to what's happening here and how does India, as I think he said, having announced the goal, we now need a roadmap to get to that goal, and whether that very ambitious goal of having sort of 100% penetration of transport of vehicles by electric vehicles can be achieved by 2030, will require a huge effort on our part. And I hope that this conference will contribute to that. There have been several others, and I think this is why this is a very encouraging sign that we have, in some sense, a very growing, intense, and engaged public discourse on this issue, as often as is characteristic of our country, because we get into this public discourse mode, as it were, and then results and solutions, in some sense, fall out of this discussion. Maybe I just want to add to this by going through sort of my own talk just now, and let me start off by saying that what, in my view, are the drivers of electric vehicle adoption or the movement towards electric vehicle in the country. Let me say one thing, which is, to begin with, as just stepping back, which is that I don't think there is going to be a very sort of smooth, linear passage from ICE, from internal combustion engines, to hybrids, to smart hybrids, to electric mobility, etc. I think there is a conversation around that. People try to argue that is probably better for us to adopt that, etc. I don't think that's probably possible. And so therefore, why am I saying that? Is that because I do want to, in some sense, jump right into what the drivers of electric vehicle of mobility are in this country, and what I see, how I see them affecting and influencing our policy going forward. I think the first driver, as you all know, would be that if we went the ICE route, etc., and the way we are going, we just cannot afford it in terms of pollution and climate change. It's just impossible. And there are lots and lots of figures available everywhere, given that our rate of urbanization, the number of large cities, the amount of congestion, even if you go to BS4, etc., etc., it's just simply not true that we can afford to go down that road of internal combustion engines, or even hybrids for that matter, because pollution is just going to be required that you have to move to zero emission vehicles as soon as possible, and so that's the first big driver. The second driver, of course, has been mentioned, which is our huge import dependence on fossil fuel, on oil particularly. 80% imports that we can, and we need to replace that and we can't possibly replace it by another source of fossil fuel, which is coal, which is the mainstay of our energy mix today. But it's seen that, and we in NITI are at the moment preparing the next version, if you like, after the Kirit Parikh version, the next version of the integrated energy policy. And there we see, I was just reviewing it yesterday and day before, that the share of coal falls very sharply, in whatever way you do, and therefore, this import dependence will go down, will have to be brought down, and the best way to do that, in my view, is to replace our dependence on transport fuel, which is what is required. At this point, it makes it 80% of our oil being imported, etc. And this is why, in a study that we just got done with the Rocky Mountain Institute, the conclusion was, and this is already published and probably on our website as well, that India can save 64% of anticipated passenger road-based mobility-related energy demand, 64%, and 37% of carbon emissions by 2030 by pursuing a shared electric and connected mobility future. Now, I think these are huge numbers, and this is why I think we need to look towards the electric mobility. But the other two words are equally important, shared and connected, because that's the way we need to go. So you have to think of electric mobility not just in isolation, but as a whole integrated model of shared and connected. The third driver, of course, is rising incomes. And rising incomes in the past. Can I just get my bottle of water? So, if we go by the past models of economic development, rising incomes translate to rising ownership or rising personal ownership of vehicles, especially cars. And as you know, you have in China now, 85 per 1,000 people per capita, you have the car ownership. In America, it's 800. We are at the moment at 20 per 1,000. And so therefore, one could say that if we followed the same model, the same path of income generated vehicle ownership, then we would also go towards those numbers. And those numbers are simply impossible for us, given the congestion, given the pollution, given our limited space in the cities, and the fact also that in the US, the figure is that a car is used about 3.5% of the time with the owner. A vehicle owned by an individual is just about 3.5% of the time on the road, and the rest of the time is sitting in the garage. In India, where we have a much bigger use of this car because of our drivers and so on, so that the individuals don't drive, but the drivers do, it's about 18%. And which is much bigger there because of our ownership is less, but also we don't have self-driven cars. We're already into, in some sense, autonomous cars because we sit at the back and somebody else drives. But that's what makes it about 18%. But even that's just simply not possible that you go down that route, etc. So the income driven and the income driver will have to change towards something which is different from personal ownership of cars. And so I think, and this is where I think you have to think through a system of very efficient, high quality public transport system, which will have to replace the private car ownership system that the world has followed so far. We simply cannot afford to go down that route. So that's why I think, and that is where I think electric mobility will play a major role. But for me, ladies and gentlemen, the most important, in far as I can see, driver of electric mobility and shared connected electric mobility is that this is one area which has just emerged now where India, if we get our act together, can be ahead of the curve of the rest of the world. This is one area which is where we have all the all the sort of, as it were, features in place, where we have all the sort of blocks in place to try and if we get it together, then we can leapfrog. And Dr. Mashelkar, whose name was quoted earlier, now uses the term pole vault into a situation where we can be in the 21st century mobility system, and we can be leaders in that, and we can be redesigning the whole transport landscape, as it were, the whole transport architecture. But if we could, as I said, and that's a big if in our case all the time, if we could get our act together and we could get all the sort of moving parts of it together. Now here, and this is where I think when I said that we have the blocks together, which is that we are a country which produces some of the best cars. I mean, we produce lots of cars, and in the sense, not the internal combustion engine, maybe we are not that efficient there, but we do have very strong car manufacturing, vehicle manufacturing capabilities. We have a very strong, features of doing the electrical part of it in terms of motors and all of that is not very complicated. And much more than that, we are one of the strongest software economies in the world, because mobility, connected and shared mobility would need, and this new landscape that I was talking about, would need that prowess, it would need that feature of getting your software, all your systems right, etc., to be able to give that modern, efficient, shared public transport. That is which will be the only way to replace the incentive from going to personalized ownership of cars. So I think this is a time, having missed some other buses in the past, this is a time that we must get onto this bus, and we must therefore get our act together. And this, and here, what Mr. Razdan had said and others, one of the key features, of course, will be R&D and innovation. And in fact, the EV movement, the zero emission vehicle movement, the shared and connected mobility movement, can also be a driver of innovation in this country. In fact, if we in the government can give the right side of incentives, and the kind of incentive that is required, this can be a driver of innovation across both private and public sector, public sector spaces. And the fact is that despite our very low R&D expense, 6% of GDP, of which 80% comes from the public sector, when we want to do something, we achieve it. And ISRO is an absolute, brilliant example that if we do focus our mind on some things, we do get that, and we therefore, and therefore it's not, we cannot just simply say that, look, it's beyond us. It cannot be, and it should not be beyond us to develop a new, innovative, not following anybody else's model, but our own ground reality, upwards based model of shared, connected and electric mobility as we go forward. So that's for me the biggest reason. That here is an opportunity. If we seize, India can then become a leader in the world going forward. So this is, those are for me the drivers. Now here, as I said earlier, we can't afford to, in any sense, be a follower. We cannot be a follower in any sense because as I said, we will, just as an example, we will have to focus our minds on how to get our major transport vehicles to electric, which is two-wheelers and three-wheelers. 19% of total vehicles on the road are those, and then two- and three-wheelers are the greatest ownership. Now, I think 80%, 82% of our journeys on the urban space is less than 5 kilometers at the moment. Now, this is where you would get a very good way of getting the three-wheelers, and they'll remain the mainstay. Similarly, you will get the passenger buses and as I said, public transport. And here we have an advantage that we have a culture of shared mobility, and and we have not yet got locked into personal ownership of cars. So therefore, we will have to focus our efforts on electric mobility, on how to first, which is the low-hanging fruit, as to how to get this huge segment of two and three-wheelers and public transport buses, as it were, onto shifting to electric mobility, and not to be worried, not be so worried about the cars and the individual cars to begin with. And because that can then create, this huge change can then create the ecosystem that can create the basis for us to do the innovation that we need to do in charging infrastructure, in the battery, in the battery technology, in maybe shifting. I just met some French people who had accompanied President Macron. Technology, they are working very hard on hydrogen fuel cell, etc., and shifting away from lithium, because lithium reserves, as you know, are now highly concentrated in a few countries, etc. I met another company who is into very, very deep now into recycling lithium batteries, because that's, it can generate a huge amount of supply. So those are the areas which can get developed if we shift irrevocably to, for a large part of our public transport system to the electric vehicle, and which I again sort of re-emphasizing the two and three-wheelers and the public buses. So that's, and that will then create a new model in the world for efficient, high-quality shared mobility. And that can be India's motto, as it were, going forward for the rest of the world. But as I mentioned, all these things about infrastructure, the charging infrastructure, the storage, and the choice between swapping of batteries and creating a infrastructure, storage infrastructure, charging infrastructure, etc., and the recycling. All of these different parts also imply that you must need a policy. You must need a policy to put it all together. So therefore, you can't just have people running along on their own, as it were, in different silos to do whatever they want to do, and therefore not standardizing or universalizing the features that you want to emphasize. And I think Niti Aayog, therefore, would be very well placed to develop this policy, and I hope that will be the task that we will fulfill going forward. In this particular case, we can't really depend either on the market completely or on ministries working in silos to deliver to us, if that is our objective, for delivering to us a brand new, innovative, our own reality-based transport model. We will need to work together, and the government will have to play a very important role. Now here very often the skepticism comes, which is that do we have the governance capability to do this? Are we really up to the task? And ladies and gentlemen, I want to submit to you that we have always been up to the task on areas that we have chosen to deliver. This fact is that we don't choose enough, and at this point of time, from where I can see in the last 6 months having moved into the government, there is a significant shift going on, in trying to say that we can do things better and more efficiently and in collaboration with the private sector within the government. Now, I think, and if this be true, then and this has to be true, because in this case, otherwise, we will again be left in some sense, clutching at straws and following other people's models and be in other people's, as it were, in the sort of wake of other people's development. Many countries, China, France, US, Korea, they are all, getting into this space as quickly as they can. Their numbers are already much higher than what we have in our case. But I am arguing in front of this august audience that today is a time that we should decide that we will be ahead of it, we will be in the forefront of it, and if we do, then I think the government effort will come forward. What are some of these features which the government should adopt to be leading the game or to be getting a coherent policy framework? One, of course, they must designate a government agency where the mission can be housed. The electric mobility mission can be housed. There has been a lot of work within the government. Cabinet notes have been prepared, etc., etc. And I think we are close to being able to identify the principal driver of this policy. And I think for me that would be almost like a important condition to go forward. The second is the government can start off being an aggregator of demand. Because if you are talking about public transport, then you're talking about government playing a role of creating electric mobility fleets. Because that is again where the real demand for these vehicles would come from fleet operators, as I said earlier, rather than individual car owners, if you like. I mean, that could be the model. So if the two things that the government can do to start building its own fleet of electric mobility vehicles, which is why although a little presumptuous maybe on our part, we've got 2 electric charging stations in Niti Aayog at the moment, and we have ordered our first electric vehicle cars out of the 10,000 that have been ordered. But the other thing is that the municipalities and the state government could encourage the fleet operators of passenger transport, passenger buses, to make the shift. Now, the second thing as a part of that is that, do you want to do this before or after or in parallel in creating your own manufacturing capabilities? Because you do not want to end up here too as an import-dependent nation. And this is why the electric mobility movement, if you like, should be and must become a movement also to really bolster and actually reinforce the Make in India movement. Now, this is the second condition, therefore, for the government, which is to create the trust and create the conditions where the government and the private sector can work together in actually introducing this and making this real. So the sort of suspicion, if you like, the antagonistic relationship between the government and the private sector, etc., must be replaced by a feature, by a process of mutual consultations, by identifying the sort of needs that the private sector may have, by insisting that they themselves follow a degree of self-regulation and not be in the process of gaming the system all the time. If we can achieve that, and I don't see why we should not be able to, I think we should, we could get this, the EV movement as also a major thrust for Make in India movement. The second, of course, I mentioned already, which is the focus strategy on 2, 3-wheelers and freight vehicles I have not mentioned so far. There is no reason for us there's no reason for us to say that the shorter haul freight vehicles, what we call the one-tonners and the ACE and some wonderful names in the industry that they have for them, why can't they shift already? Now for this, there is a big choice now at the moment that if you want to do this, would you then have to have a charging infrastructure in place? Some friends, and I think they've got a very strong argument here, is like saying that no, we may shift towards a battery swapping model. Now this has been tried in some countries. Some people have said that this failed in Israel, etc. But I don't think we are in the same conditions. You could then use your innumerable retail outlets as battery swapping stations, which can then make, and there are models that I've seen. Niti Aayog had organized a very comprehensive conference, I think on the 9th of January, where all the stakeholders were there, and the lesson and the sounds that the sort of learnings that came out of that conference were that you could design your freight vehicles such that the battery swapping time could be minimized, so that they're not inbuilt into the chassis, but are located as such that they can be moved in and out very quickly. And the battery swapping companies could be brought in whose job would be to have huge battery swapping stations, on the top of which could be solar powered, charging stations, solar powered charge generators, so that you can have a system where you could use and integrate the private sector into this in a very effective manner, both at the retail level as well as the sort of charging level. So that's one way that you can think of sidestepping the need for developing a massive charging infrastructure all along your highways and along your sort of routes within the city. So that's the second one. The third, of course, is that we will have to evolve a regulatory framework to facilitate the electric storage opportunities. This will incentivize local manufacturing, and we'll have to coordinate the development of relevant standards and protocols. Now for both AC and DC chargers. And Mr. Razdan was whispering in my ears when I'm sitting there that we should also be very clear in our mind that this would be a service that is provided for the electric mobility cars, and rather than treat it as a commercial sale, etc. So that the whole regime here, and this is where DISCOMs will have to be brought into the game. This is where the Ministry of Power is already onto it in some ways, saying that we need a different protocol for the charging stations and a different, way of looking at it, rather than thinking of it as sale of petrol and therefore a sale of electricity. So otherwise you will not be able to encourage it. The other thing, of course, which is already there now inbuilt into our GST policies, that you would have noticed, and I've had several representations from the hybrid car producers saying that this is not fair on them. The GST rate on electric vehicles is appreciably lower than that on the hybrid vehicles at the moment, and I think that should continue to encourage the shift from one to the other. I've talked already about innovation and research. This will have to be much better, but this is where, again, the Mashelkar model of private and public sector working together, as it did for the National Chemical Laboratory in Pune, must be brought into existence and must be encouraged. And of course, finally, the scrapping policy. We'll have to get into this into a very organized and a well sort of structured manner, because without that, you will not get the clankers off the road, and there will be no incentive to shift to the EVs, especially which we not heard very often, the scrapping policy for public vehicles. Whether, which public transport vehicles, whether it's two-wheelers, three-wheelers, freights and buses, etc. That is where the focus had to shift. So, and last really is that how do we integrate and connect different modes of transport as they are shifting to electric vehicles. And therefore, you will need to have a comprehensive urban transport policy. You'll have to create a few centers where such a model, connected policy plan can be put in operation and then replicate them all over the country. Because without that, again, we will not be able to shift to this new architecture of urban transport, which is based on zero emissions, shared mobility, and interconnected modes of transport. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.